All right. Thank you for joining me, Noah. I appreciate you getting on a pod with me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to talk Spurs Suns.
Yeah, excellent. Oh man, we just had a bunch of Suns fans turn this one off right now. Nobody wants to talk, nobody in Sunsland wants to talk Spurs Suns just in general. However, today's topic is about how can the Suns get and should the Suns get Thaddeus Young from the Spurs. Now, the Suns acquired Thaddeus Young in a trade with the Chicago Bulls this offseason, where the Spurs sent off DeMar DeRozan to the Bulls, and for salary matching purposes, they had to get something back. So Thad Young was included in that deal going back to the Spurs. Noah, can you give us a quick overview of how the Spurs approach the offseason and how they're approaching this coming season as a team?
Yeah, so they kind of took a surprising route. I thought they may just hit the reset button. It kind of looked like that. They were talking about moving on from Rudy and Patty and DeMar DeRozan, and then they went and signed Doug McDermott. They traded DeMar DeRozan in a sign and trade for Aminu and Thaddeus Young. So it sort of felt like it wasn't necessarily a rebuild, but a retool. Like they really believed in these young players they have, and DeJounte Murray and Derek White and Lonnie Walker and the whole lot of them. I mean, there's a ton of them. And it was an interesting route that they took. They also signed Zach Collins. So he's a guy who probably won't be available, like Popovich said, until after Christmas. And it's a weird year for them. It feels like they're once again sort of going to be stuck in flux. They don't really have a proven go-to option. They don't really have an identity outside of being young, playing fast, relying on the defensive end of the ball. And we saw some good stuff in the preseason, but again, it's a preseason opener against a shorthanded Jazz team. So I'm not sure you can read a lot into it, but it was an encouraging start nonetheless.
Okay, so that does you make it the way you described it is that the Spurs kind of did a retooling. They do have a lot of young players, but they didn't just completely hit the reset button in the offseason. Do you think that has to do with Popovich, Greg Popovich, as the coach, approaching? I mean, he's well past Medicare age, so you've got to wonder how many years he's got left, and maybe he didn't want to have a 20-win season on his docket as he goes out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've said it for a few years now, but as long as Greg Popovich's here, I don't think there's really going to be a hard reset. I think once he's gone, and I'm not saying I want him gone or anything like that, but once he's gone, you'll probably get a better idea of where this team's headed. Although right now they do seem to be committed to a youth movement. Like I said, they have good young pieces, but do they have an elite young piece, right? Do they have a Trey Young, a Zion Williamson, a Luka Doncic? Not
Of
really.
DeAndre Ayton.
Even a DeAndre Ayton. They don't really have a guy like that, at least right now. That I guess that's to be seen if you're optimistic. But I think, yeah, as long as Popovich is here, we're going to see a team that tries to compete for the playoffs. We saw that where they sort of held on to DeMar and LaMarcus longer than a lot of people thought they should. And who knows if this is Pop's last year. I know it's his last year of his extension, but Zach Lowe mentioned last week that Popovich might come back for another season, just depending on how this one goes. So we'll have to see how this season goes. And if it goes well, then I wouldn't be that surprised if he comes back and tries to make a push behind this young core.
So, what do you think about moving on from DeMar DeRozan? Do you feel like that was a necessary move, even though they're retooling and not rebuilding?
Yeah, I definitely thought it was a move that was necessary. I mean, for years, they've sort of been propping up their young core of DeJounte Murray and Derek White, Lonnie Walker, Devin Vassell now. And it's sort of hard to get those guys the touches and on ball reps and minutes that they need to play and develop and really take charge as long as DeMar's there, right? Because if DeMar's there, he's the proven all star, he's your highest paid player. He's, a seasoned veteran. He's been in the league for more than a decade. So it's hard to, with him there, to say, all right, DeMar, take a back seat to DeJounte, take a back seat to Derek. And so I think it was a sort of necessary move for them to move on from him, and not just so that these young guys could get touches and shots, but also so they could build a better identity. Because with him in the lineup defensively, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but he's one of the worst defensive players at his position in the league. And for a team that preaches and has preached defense before everything over, the course of Greg Popovich's tenure as the head coach, he just didn't make a lot of sense as the guy who sort of runs the show. So it was a necessary move, I think. The same thing with LaMarcus Aldridge, Rudy Gay, Patty Mills, but maybe moves that happened a little bit too late. I think really in the grand scheme of things, DeMar DeRozan was the only player they got value out of. Like, they bought out LaMarcus Aldridge, Rudy Gay and Patty Mills walked for nothing. And maybe that was part of the plan. They did provide value, even if they didn't, get a first round pick or young players back. They provided the veteran leadership that I think sometimes gets overlooked. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably more valuable for this young team to have these touches, and we'll see what they can do this year.
So a team always talks positively about what they get back in a trade. So I'm sure the front office and the coach has said, "Oh, we love Thaddeus Young. We love Aminu came back as well, right, in that trade. We love those guys. Can't wait to have them playing for the team." But what is the energy around Spurs Nation, among the fans, among the people about Thad Young's presence on the team? Do you feel like that's a stopgap where he's going to stay with the team this year and is helpful in a different way than DeMar was, but still as a veteran leader? Or do you feel like the clock is ticking?
It kind of feels like the clock is ticking since he got here. There's been a lot of rumblings, not just, from the fans, but from writers that look, this guy is probably on the move. They're probably going to cut Al Farouk Aminu. He's in the last year of his contract. They can eat
Mm.
it. They don't have to worry about, stretching it out or anything like that, having to, have it on the salary cap for years and years and years. But with Al Farouk Aminu, I think he's such a good player for what this young core needs if they're trying to win. But it's, what can they do with this roster? They have 17 players on NBA contracts. They've got to get it down to 15. They re-signed Keita Bates-Diop. They went out and signed Jocelyn Dale and Zach Collins. They still have Luka Šimanić. Where does he fit in? Can they roster him without cutting somebody else that they want to keep? And to me, the answer is no. And it's interesting with media day, it came and went, and they've talked to Thad during some of not just media day, but during the training camps. And it seems like his general attitude is, I've talked to RC, I've talked to Greg Popovich, I've talked to Brian Wright, and as long as I'm here, I'm going to do my best to be a Spur. But if they move me, then it's part of the business. And I think that's probably what's going to happen, right? Like it feels like they're going to move him,
Mhm.
because if they weren't going to move him, it doesn't make a lot of sense why they kept him out of the preseason game. He didn't play at all yesterday. Neither did Al Farouk Aminu. And if he's a player who they do want to incorporate with that young core, now's the time to start building chemistry. I know that he's playing with them in practice. The young guys have a lot of good things to say about him. Luka has said good things about him. DeJounte has said good things about him. But, if he's not playing with them on the court, how does he build chemistry? So it feels like he's a guy who gets moved. I don't have any solid intel on that,
Sure.
but it does feel like he's going to get moved at some point, if not before the season starts.
I do think that's interesting that they didn't play him at all in the preseason game, because my next question was going to be, do you feel like, the Spurs organization in general, I know you said they let go of a few of their players for nothing this summer, so they weren't really looking for maximum value back in trade. I feel like the only reason Thad Young got there, from my narrow point of view, I feel like the only reason Thad Young even came back for DeMar is because DeMar had salary, and they had to do matching on salary. So my question, I guess, is did you feel like the trade is going to happen, whoever he goes to, before the season starts rather than at the trade deadline to maximize value? But then if he didn't play in the preseason game, kind of sounds like the first option, right?
Yeah, it certainly feels like he's going to be moved during the preseason, or but at least before the season starts, that October 17th date that they have set before that. There's some interesting notes here. I know that he can't be moved alongside another player or pick for 60 days, which means October 10th is the first day that they can include like another pick or another player in any trade that involves him. But if they want to just do a trade straight up, just Thaddeus Young for, whoever on another team, they can do it at any point. But I'm not sure, really, outside of the Phoenix Suns, and I'm sure we're going to get to this in a minute, but outside of the Phoenix Suns, there really haven't been any sort of rumors or rumblings that there's another destination or team that's really interested in him. Now, I think that'll change if he isn't moved before the season. There'll definitely be teams who are interested in his services by the trade deadline. But as for now, it does feel, I know I've said this a couple of times, but it does feel like he's going to get moved before the season starts.
Yeah, I feel like if a team doesn't need to make a trade right away, like the receiving team. And when I say right away, I mean before training camp starts. The receiving team might want that Young earlier to get him integrated with the team, earlier in the season. But we're back to an 82 game season. So does it really matter if he's been fully integrated into the lineup yet? And I can see why the Spurs would want to hold out for just in case of a disaster situation in their lineup. Somebody gets injured, somebody comes back. There's issues with this, that, or the other thing, and all of a sudden you need a playable player at forward. You might be suddenly willing to give up a little bit more value back, to your, back in the trade. And so maybe the Spurs are just waiting for a last second offer from another team. that could help them out. Like you said, they did sign Doug McDermott. So as far as the front line is concerned, they did give big money to Doug McDermott. You said already that Zach Collins is not expected to play right away. So even though they gave some money to Zach Collins, he's not going to be there in the front line. Um, let's see. I'm looking at the other bigs on the team. Of course, you've got the Jakob Pertl in the middle. But really, who else do you have? Luka Shamanich? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, Luka Šamanić. He's a guy who
Shamanich.
I really like. He's a nice kid, but he just hasn't found many minutes in San Antonio, hasn't been consistently producing even when he does get minutes. And it kind of feels like the clock is ticking on him. So I'm not sure where he fits, because even last night, he didn't check in until I think near the end of the third quarter, which is interesting
Really?
considering,
In the
Keldon
first
Johnson.
preseason game?
Yeah. And last year he hardly played at all during the preseason. Pop is a guy who I think more so than other coaches sort of shows his hand in the preseason, says, these are the guys I'm running with. And if you're not in the rotation, there's a chance you may not be there come regular season. So who knows? Maybe I'm looking a little bit too much into it. But last year, the guys who didn't get a lot of minutes in the preseason didn't get a lot of minutes during the regular
Look,
season. And
yeah.
Shaman, it's just his third year. It's his third year. He already showed he can play in the G League. He showed he could produce a little bit when the Spurs went through that COVID stretch where they were really short on players, but the production isn't consistent. The skills that were there in theory, like the shooting, the ball handling, which are rare skills for a big, they're still more theoretical than tangible at the moment. So this is a big year for him.
So did you say that the Spurs have 17 guys under guaranteed contract?
Yep, they have 17 guys under guaranteed contracts. They've still got to cut 2 people before the season starts. They have 1 guy on a 2-way contract, which is Joe Wieskamp. Obviously, doesn't count towards that 17, and they still have another 2-way contract left. But we'll see what they do. Really, in my opinion, what's going to end up happening is they're definitely cutting Al-Farouq Aminu. I mean, he just doesn't really make sense for this roster. He hasn't been productive or healthy for a few years. And then you look at the rest of that roster. Why did they sign Jock Landale? Why did he buy an apartment in San Antonio? He's settled.
Right.
Doesn't seem like he's moving, right? Like it seems like he's
No.
going to be there.
Yeah.
And Thaddeus Young, I talked to his wife just briefly yesterday, just sort of said, welcome to San Antonio. Hope you're liking it. And she seemed to be under the impression, and I don't want to put words in her mouth or anything, but that they were going to be there at least for a little bit. So maybe this trade doesn't happen. Maybe they cut someone like, Drew Eubanks or Luka Šamanić. I don't know. It seems weird to cut a third-year player was a first-round pick, but he's a guy who's hardly found any playing time. And I know Drew Eubanks was undrafted, but Drew Eubanks has looked phenomenal, since he came in as that
When he
second unit
plays,
guy
he's
once
like
they
the
moved.
Boban of San Antonio. It's like when he plays, it's been phenomenal, but he hasn't played very much, right?
Exactly. And once they moved from LaMarcus, they moved Drew Eubanks, not anybody else, not Gorgie Jing, who they went and fought on the buyout market, but they moved Drew Eubanks into that second unit center position. He played well in that. He looked really good in the preseason. I talked to him during the preseason. I had him on one of my podcasts. He said he's been working on 3-point shooting, and lo and behold, he came out the first preseason game, knocked down his first 3. So he looks to be improved. He's hungry. He wants to be out there. He wants to be part of the Spurs organization. So the only guy who you can really point at and say, okay, that guy's definitely gone is Aminu. I don't know who that last guy they're moving or cutting is definitely going to be. I can't definitively point to anyone but Al-Farouq Aminu, and maybe Thaddeus Young moves in a trade, but really I have no clue at this point. It seems like they're still
Well,
open.
let's go down the trade path. So if Thaddeus Young is being traded and they haven't done it yet, it's either they're waiting for a better offer or they're waiting until they can include him with another player, like the aggregation rule. And that aggregation rule comes into effect either for the Spurs, including another guy with Thad Young, or a third team being involved. And we don't have any insight on third teams. Not going to make any speculation at all. Nothing's been talked about. Why would a third team even be involved? I don't know. Maybe the Spurs are trying to hold out for some draft compensation the Suns can't offer, because even though, look, Thad Young's not worth a first round pick coming back in trade after you just got him as a salary cap fill in. However, the Suns couldn't trade a first anyway if they wanted to, because they've got their first tied up in the whenever the Chris Paul first round pick goes over to Oklahoma City, and that's got some protections all the way through 2027. So there's no way the Suns are including a first round pick in a trade. It would have to be, a second round pick or 2. They do have all those going forward after I think they traded 2022s, but going forward they have their second round picks. So let's say that the Spurs are waiting to aggregate a second player in off your own roster. There's no way that second player is Al-Farouq Aminu because that Thaddeus Young makes 14.1 million. Aminu makes 10.1. There's no way the Suns are sending 25 million back because the only guys that would qualify for is you're not getting Devin Booker, you're not getting Chris Paul, and none of the other guys make enough money to even make that make sense. So the Suns, what's interesting about the Suns roster is that they really do have just the two really high paid players, and then everybody else is either on rookie contracts or mid levels. So that just isn't going to happen. So if there is a throw in like the to get themselves down to the 15 players, um, the Suns can't do that. I mean, it would have to be like, gosh, because the Suns have to send back minimum Dario Saric and another player. That's two coming back. The Spurs would have to include three players going out to even make a dent toward the roster for the Spurs to get under. So I'm really curious if that's even the issue. I think it's more that the Spurs are holding out for possibly just a little bit better deal than an all fully injured Dario Saric for the season because he's going to be mostly out for the season. And then 1 year left on his contract after that. Saric does look like a Spurs type player in that he does all the little things, doesn't make a ton of money, and is appreciative of whatever he gets. And then throwing in a young like a Jalen Smith for just rolling the dice on a front court player. The Spurs do not have a high end looking front court player on their roster as far as young right now, especially if they're not sold on Shamanic. And that could be a Jalen Smith type, although I got to tell you, the dude looks like baby giraffe. He looks like he just came out of the mother's womb, and he's moving around on his long legs and arms. Although he's a very aggressive baby giraffe, he gets tons of rebounds. He just looks like he doesn't know what to do with his arms and legs sometimes. But he's got some potential, and a really good coaching staff could coach him into a really, really good player someday. Have you guys on your end thought about that rumored Dario Saric and Jalen Smith package coming back? And of course, that obviously, if it's just one Thad Young and two of those guys, then that makes your roster crunch even worse. Have you guys thought about that working itself out?
Yeah, so the only scenario I can see that really makes sense or could work for them, and this is sort of a convoluted concept for me to sort of lay out here, but I want to give it to you. So I think getting Dario Saric makes sense, grabbing him, and then getting someone like Jalen Smith. I do a lot of our draft content. I wasn't very high on him. I had a second round grade on him when we did
Yeah.
it. Still not high on him. I'm not that interested, but I know that RC Buford personally went to scout him, went to a Maryland game, got to see him up close and personal. So maybe there's some intrigue there. Maybe they like him more than I do, which obviously matters. If they like him, doesn't matter what I think. And then once they have that, obviously it puts them in a worse roster crunch, but they could apply for a disabled player exception, which would essentially make Dario Saric not part of the roster for the season. I know that he's rumored to be out for the entire year, which would apply for the disabled
Mm-hmm.
player exception. And then they could probably just leave it at that, never use that, and still just make those two cuts. So I'm not sure if that could actually work. That's just sort of a theory that it could possibly work. But looking at it, I think it makes sense for them to get Jalen Smith because, look, I don't know that they're 100% sold on Luka Šamanić. Maybe that adds some more competition. Maybe they can do something where they waive him, sign him to a two-way. I'm not 100% sure. Really, the roster crunch is the issue, just them trying to get down to that 15 players. So it's going to be tough. I like the idea of having Dario Saric, even if he's not available this year, being able to play next year. I think he's a guy who is a rotation guy, clearly
Mm-hmm.
still at this point in his career, but it's going to be really tough just knowing what we know about the San Antonio roster and them needing to cut it down to 15.
Yeah, it's funny about Sharch. The Suns would love to have a healthy Sharch back in the lineup. He is a rotation player, as you said. He actually, it feels like he's been around the NBA landscape for 1,000 years because he started playing as a 16-year-old in the pros, and people have been scouting him to come over to the NBA since then. So that's 10 years. So it feels like, oh gosh, you mentioned at this point in his career, he's still just 26 years old. 27, I think, this year. So he does have a good career going forward and as a rotation player, he's definitely viable. Love his work ethic. Nobody tries harder than Dario. He does the most with his level of athleticism as anybody could, and that feels like a good team's player. So yeah, definitely that there's value there. If you did the disabled player exception, do you have to cut him though, right?
I think you have to cut him. I'm not 100% sure. I know that they did it with like the Warriors applied for it last year. They used it to sign someone in place of Klay Thompson. So I don't think you have to cut them, but they're not
Oh, got
eligible to
it.
play.
Okay.
Yeah, they can't play for an entire season for the entire season. They have to be
But
out
they don't have to
for
be
the
cut.
entire
So you
season.
could have Sharge back the next year after doing the DP this year.
Yes,
Okay.
and that player doesn't count towards the roster size anymore. So I think that's the only way they would make it work, where it would almost feel like a one for one player, and then they still have to make the two cuts. So it
Okay.
doesn't make their roster issues worse, but they still have to deal with cutting two players at the end of the day.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the back end of the Spurs salary structure. Um, and I'm just thinking if they really wanted to include a second player in there, because let's just keep going down the path. Which of those back end guys that are on guaranteed contracts could be included? Because the Suns do have an open roster spot. So if they traded both Jalen Smith and Dario Saric, then that's basically three roster spots that are available in coming back. Thad Young takes one of them. Um, who else would you say would be a natural inclusion in there if they could keep the salaries matching enough?
I think Luka Šamanić makes a lot of sense just because, like we talked about, I'm not really 100% sure that they're sold on him being one of their future, players of their future who they continue to build around, or at least be an ancillary piece to their core. Maybe Keita Bates-Diop. He's a guy who I'm actually kind of confused why they re-signed him in the offseason. They re-signed him to a guaranteed deal. Of course, it was just a league minimum deal, but he was a guy who didn't really play a lot. He had decent numbers. He had some flashes of being able to play some defense, shoot the ball a little bit, but nothing that I thought, okay, this guy needs to be on the roster next year. And the Spurs thought otherwise. They brought him back, but I don't see him getting minutes anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
he's a guy who plays three, plays a little bit of four, and those spots are pretty well soaked up. I mean, it's not like Keldon Johnson or Luka Šamanić or even a guy like Devin Vassell or Thaddeus Young, if he is on the roster, or Doug McDermott, are going to cede minutes to this guy. It's probably not going to happen. Last year, he was on a two-way contract. He's at the max amount of two-way contracts one can sign in their career, so he wasn't eligible for another one. But
Oh
it was
wow.
an interesting move to me that they re-signed him, brought him back on a guaranteed deal. I think it's a 2-year deal, so it was weird. But there are some moves that happened this offseason that I didn't really understand when the Spurs made them. I think they improved the roster, but when you look at the roster construction, it reminds me a lot of what the Magic had going a few years ago, where they have a guy like Vucevic and Gordon, and they have Fournier. So they have a guy who's all-star level player, some guys who were good next to him, but what does that get you really? Seventh seed, eighth seed, you're sort of in this NBA purgatory where you're not picking high enough to really find a star, but you're also not bad enough or good enough to compete for anything. So it's a weird area the Spurs are in. Maybe someone takes that leap, but overall, I thought it was a good offseason if they want to continue trying to win, like Greg Popovich clearly wants to do. But for the team long term, I'm not sure it made a ton of sense.
What do you think is the Spurs legit most likely ceiling? Like not fantasy ceiling, but most likely ceiling this year.
I think most likely ceiling, if they can be sort of what the New York Knicks were a year ago, where they have a really great defense, but their half court offense is just dysfunctional. I think they can sort of break 500, maybe get close to that 500 area, be a play-in team. But really, I don't have a ton of confidence in that. I know that the New York Knicks had a guy like Julius Randle. He's an all-star. He's a guy who made an all-NBA team. DeJounte Murray, Derek White, those are probably their two best players. And I'm not sure they really have that in them, especially in the Western Conference. Like, you look at the plethora of guards who are elite, who are all-star, all-NBA level in the Western Conference. And the Phoenix Suns have two of them. They have Chris Paul and they have Devin Booker. And I don't think anybody would say either of those guys are the best at their positions in the conference. And then you look at what the Spurs have in Derek White and DeJounte Murray, fine young players, not as young as they used to be, 25 and 27, but I just don't see them being an elite team or even a playoff team. And I know that a lot of Spurs fans have sort of come after me for that opinion, but I try to be honest. I try not to, blow smoke up anybody, and tell them
Mhm.
that this is going to be a great team. I think they can be average if they reach their ceiling, which it pains me to say that, but that's just how I feel.
Sure. No, absolutely. Hey, look, you're talking to a Suns fan whose team didn't make the playoffs for 10 straight years. So I understand the need to be realistically skeptical on a team when they're in transition. They just are. Your Spurs are in transition. Um, it looks like Keita Bates Diop, because he re-signed this summer, couldn't be traded till December anyway.
Yeah.
Let's say if we did a deal where it's Dario and Jalen, because you've got to put those two together to get to close to Thad Young's contract. That does get him to Thad Young's contract. Then the Spurs would almost certainly want to include another player because they don't want to make their roster crunch worse. Um, would that be a Daquan Jeffries or a Trey Jones? Or I guess you're saying Shamanic, but that's another 3 million. I'm not sure exactly. I think it's got to be within 75%. So possibly that could be included without any more players involved going back. So what do you think between Jeffries and Trey Jones? Who would you rather include?
Well, I'd rather include Daquan Jeffries, but for some reason, Basketball Reference has him listed on their roster, but he's actually not part of their roster anymore. He was just
Oh,
part of the Summer League roster. They had
okay,
picked him
never
up
mind
off of
then.
waivers,
Can't be
so it
him.
would have to be Trey Jones. But he's a guy who, if I'm San Antonio, I'd be a little bit reluctant to move on from him for anything other than a late first round pick. I mean, he's a guy who I had a first round grade on him during the draft a year ago. He came out, didn't play a ton, but he looked really good in the G League. He looked even better in Summer League, and they've said a lot of good things about him during the training camp process. He was one of those players they mentioned as the 3 or 4 guys who've taken a leap this year. And so if I'm the Spurs, and I really do believe in him, and I think I got tremendous value for him in the second round as a first round sort of player, I wouldn't be willing to move him, even if you're getting someone like Jalen Smith, who, in my opinion, just isn't an equitable or an equal
Sure.
sort of prospect. So I wouldn't be that willing to move on from him, but I do think I know that the Suns can't move on from a first round pick in consecutive years, but I would assume that their first round pick will parlay this year. They won't have to use a protection. So making that assumption, they would be able to give a 2024 first round pick. So if that was the case and they could do that and you moved on from Shea Jones, I think I would be okay with that. But even then, it sort of leaves their point guard rotation pretty thin because at the moment, the only true point guards, if you want to call them that, is DeJounte Murray and Trey Jones. They've got Bryn Forbes, who is a point guard sized player, but he's really more of an undersized
Yeah.
shooting guard, a
Right.
guy who doesn't really run an offense, doesn't really handle the ball a lot. So I think they probably want to stick on or at least hold on to Trey Jones for the moment.
See, that kind of explains probably why we're still in a delay mode, even if the Spurs are interested in trading Thad Young to the Suns, and the Suns interested in trading for Thad Young with that Dario and Jalen Smith package to match salary, because Jalen's the only one who makes reasonable enough money at 4.4 million this year, and Dario's 9 million to get close to Thad Young's 14, because despite the Spurs topping out at basically an average team, their young salaries, their young contracts are guys you don't want to just throw in. You don't have any real throwaway tradable contracts because you can't include Bates Diop until December. So, um, I mean, it's and the Suns can't include extra draft compensation to equify it. Now, you could theoretically, the Suns could call OKC and say, you know what, we want to remove our restrictions and just give you the 2022 pick. The Suns could do that. Is it really smart to do that at this point? No, because what if the Suns have a rash of injuries and all of a sudden that 2022 pick is a mid-round pick? You don't want to just give up on it, but so maybe the 2022 late, or you could just change the protections to where eventually it becomes, 2023 at the latest. Still, I don't see the Suns would have to do that to free up an earlier first round pick. So that's where it gets tough, and that's why you might see a third team being included. But then, what would that third team do? The third team would, I don't know. That's what makes it complicated and why we're still sitting here at a stalemate, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, there's not a lot of teams who can just straight up trade for Thad Young. And I think the Spurs probably would be looking for a first rounder. I know that you said that, maybe he's not worth it as a guy who was sort of a throw in. But if you look at that Chicago roster, I'm not sure how much Bulls basketball. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't watch a lot of Bulls basketball last year.
I did not. No.
But he was arguably their second or third best player until Nikola Vucevic got there. He's a guy who averaged a career high in assists, nearly 5 assists per game.
Yeah.
Still a really good rebounder for his size. Still a solid defender, can guard 2, 3, 4, even some small ball fives, depending on the lineup. And he's a guy who really works, at least for the Spurs young core, if they wanted him on the roster. He works really well as this sort of connector piece, a guy who doesn't need the ball in his hands, who's going to do all the little things, who's going to go play defense. And, he can't shoot, and the Spurs were one of the worst shooting teams in the league last season. But one thing he can do is move without the ball. He's a good cutter. He knows how to get his, the ball to the teammates on time. He can sort of be a playmaking hub from the post. So there's a lot of good things about him. But I also think, there's probably a good amount of teams who are saying, hey, we could probably just wait another season and not have to get rid of a draft capital to get him. So his value is just sort of tough to put one on him, but I like him. I'm not sure he's going to be part of this roster, but we'll have to wait and see, because you're right. It is just so complicated. I'm not sure that a deal gets done immediately.
Yep. So we'll see what happens with the Suns and the Spurs acquiring Thad Young. I don't know how many big trade exceptions there are out there. That the big chunk where you can acquire a single player into a. I don't know how many there are out there. I know a year ago the Warriors did that to acquire Kelly Oubre Jr. As a just a one-off where you got very little draft compensation just simply because they could add a player for nothing. The Warriors in that case. There may be a team or two out there who can take Thad Young into their trade exception without sending a whole lot back. Then basically you can get that at least some level of draft compensation back and without hurting your roster construction. So maybe the Spurs are holding out for that. Who knows? We'll see what happens. Thank you so much, Noah, for joining me today to talk about Thad. And it does sound like, to wrap everything up, it sounds like the Spurs have not totally set it up to where Thad Young is going to stay with the team all year. They're open to trade. Everyone seems open to the trade. It's just a matter of finding a good fit for him. So good luck to the Spurs this year. I hope you guys do well. No, really. Now that you guys aren't going to knock necessarily the Suns out of the playoffs, knock on wood right now, knocking on wood, then I'm all for the Spurs. I have a lot of respect for Greg Popovich as an individual. I love his takes on things non-basketball related. I love him as a coach, as long as he's not beating the Suns with his coaching. And of course, I always developed great respect for the individual players on the Spurs too, outside of beating the Suns. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck to your team this year. And we'll talk to you again soon, hopefully.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.